Great, I'm Professor Green, and let's go ahead and finish up part 3 of chapter 11. What is a fixed versus a floating exchange rate? So going back now, and now you can see how the world can be affected when we go from fixed to floating. What does that really mean, and what is the case for each? So why would we even want to do a floating rate when we've seen such volatility? Well, there is a case for the floating exchange rate. So there's monetary policy autonomy. So there's a removal of the obligation to maintain exchange rate parity, restores monetary control to a government, right? Sovereignty is a big word that comes to mind, right? So really important to make sure that the governments feel like they are in control of their own government and they're able to move, the exchange rate if they need to help their economy move forward. With a fixed system, a country's ability to expand or contract its money supply is limited by the need to maintain exchange rate parity. So that this is, they only put 2 bullet points here, but I put down some notes here just to note, that to maintain parity, countries were limited to use monetary policy to expand or contract their economies. And so, right, they just have now more tools to expand or contract their economies. There's monetary expansion, which sometimes leads to inflation, and then that puts pressure on a fixed exchange rate. And then we have monetary extraction, which leads to higher interest rates potentially, then an inflow of money from abroad, and this puts also pressure on a fixed exchange rate. So you can see like a couple of different scenarios here of why or why not you'd want a floating exchange rate. Let's move into the next 2 cases for a floating exchange rate. First is the trade balance adjustments. So again, imports and exports, when you see this, balance of trade payments, we're saying that works more smoothly under a floating exchange rate regime. Everything seems to just work itself out in many ways. Under Bretton Woods, under that fixed exchange rate system, the IMF approval was needed to correct a permanent deficit in a balance of trade that could not be corrected by domestic policy alone. So again, you had to get the IMF involved, and then it just kind of, feels to governments like somebody's always needing to be watching them, and they wanted to be a little bit more autonomous. Also, crisis recovery, and this shows up with Iceland and South Korea. Supporters of flowing exchange rates argue that they automatically help countries deal with economic crises. So investors take their money out of the country, driving down the currency, which then stimulates exports. And I love the example of Iceland. When this happened to them, they had, a huge crisis in 2008, but then that drove down their currency, and the price of their fish dropped. And then they could very quickly, and Iceland is an island, right? They could very then easily and quickly start exporting all this fish. And then that stimulates naturally their economy. And now they're doing great. I was just there a handful of years ago, and people are just flooding to move there. There's amazing infrastructure, and they've really gotten themselves back on their feet. And that, the dropped currency helps the economy get back with their exports. Same thing happened in South Korea. And you can see where this goes wrong sometimes with Greece now, because Greece is attached to the euro. And when Greece has been having all these different problems within their economy, within their country, they can't change their exchange rate because they have the euro, and they can depend on devaluing the currency to help their economy. And so their economy is still continuing to struggle. And now the IMF has to get involved, and other countries to just help them, support them in other ways. So it's really, really nice when we have that floating exchange rate to use that, as I said, as another tool for economic progress. Let's now talk about the case for fixed exchange rates, because, right, some people still think that this could be a way to go. It requires maintaining exchange rate parity. It also ensures that the governments do not expand their monetary supplies at inflationary rates. So if we had a fixed rate, right, then Biden wouldn't be able to just print money, and then we wouldn't have all this inflation. So, right, we can see that some people might like this. It also happens because politicians often don't want to raise taxes, right? Just like Biden or like President Johnson, many politicians, they don't want to raise taxes. And so then they'll say, oh, well, I'll just print money instead, and then I'll be a more popular politician. But in the long run, that's not necessarily always the best way to go. It also prevents more speculation and prevents destabilizing forecasting what's going to happen, because it's just more stable. And in the 1980s, we saw that the US dollar was rising and falling. As I said, in 1985, it was doing quite well. In 1980 to 85, it doing quite well, but then all of a sudden, 85 to 87, it just totally crashed. And this can really distort the import and export prices. And there's can be a lot of volatility that people don't want to worry about. And so there's a lot of uncertainty associated with floating exchange rates. And so as an international business person, right, I get that, right? Because it makes business transaction riskier. And for companies maybe are hesitant to do international business, if they see a floating exchange rate, that's one thing maybe to say, like, maybe we won't do it. And it'll hamper their decision to move forward. And then the last thing is the case for fixed exchange rates, that there's a trade balance adjustments and economic recovery. Floating rates help adjust trade imbalances and can help with economic recovery after a crisis. And a depreciating exchange rate will help boost inflation. So let's go ahead and hop on to the next slide. Right. So who is right? Surprisingly, really, there's no real agreement as to which system is better. The economists can't agree. History shows that a fixed exchange rate regime will not work. Obviously, a different system might be more enduring and foster stability that would facilitate more rapid growth in international trade. This is what we're going to talk about here in the next section. Exchange rate regimes in practice. So right now, 21% of IMF members have freely floating currencies, 23% have a managed float, right? Which is a little bit different, and 5% have no legal tender of their own. So, okay, excluding the EU countries that use the euro, that's different. So this is right that where countries are using the US dollar for the most part. And the remaining countries use less flexible systems such as pegged arrangements or adjustable pegs. So, right, we're really talking about this 40% here, which are the bigger countries. Right, are we talking about floating freely or a managed float? Before we get into that, let's just quickly review pegged exchange rates, because you will fall upon those. Countries peg the value. It's popular among smaller nations, as I mentioned, Belize, not Brazil. And there's some evidence that adopting a peg exchange rate regime moderates inflationary pressures on a country. So again, if they, have some issues, attracting FDI, et cetera, and they want to make it sound and look like they are more stable than they were on their previous currency, then they will adopt the US dollar for the most part. Okay, what are currency boards? A country commits to converting its domestic currency on demand into another currency at a fixed exchange rate. Hong Kong did this, as well as Argentina, but okay, so as we've seen many times, Argentina can't seem to stay on board with very much, so they abandoned it in 2002. Bulgaria does this, Estonia, Lithuania, where they hold reserves of the foreign currency at the fixed exchange rate equal to at least 100% of the domestic currency issued. And this has really worked well for Hong Kong. It's really made people want to invest in Hong Kong. It's made their currency very stable. Additional domestic notes and coins can be introduced only if there are foreign exchange reserves to back it up. So they need to have these reserves. So they need to have a pretty, strong economy. And under a currency board system, the government lacks the ability to set interest rates. And so that was kind of a hard thing, maybe, in my opinion, if I was, if I'm coming from an American point of view, hard thing that, Hong Kong couldn't set their own interest rates, which I think is very strange, right? Because living in America, every bank can set their own interest rates according to what the government says. But in Hong Kong, it was different, to have a whole country not being able to have that end up being able to do that, but they felt that it was worth it, because then people would feel that their investments in Hong Kong were more stable, and that's really what they were looking for, and they did it, right? Hong Kong is a fabulous place now to live and to work, or it has been for the past decade, for this reason. They've really moved forward amazingly with their economy. And so they are one of the few Asian countries, Asian areas that where their currency did not devalue during the 1997 Asian crisis. So really nice work there by Hong Kong. What's the modern role now of the IMF? As I said, there's been some heavy criticism. They have been expanding their activity over the past 30 years. They've redefined their mission now, really focusing on lending money to countries experiencing financial crisis in exchange for enacting certain macroeconomic policies, as we saw with Egypt. Sometimes they can be a little bit too strict. And it's grown to 189 countries, 40 of which have some type of IMF program in place. So really, at the moment, my personal opinion, what I see is that, countries do welcome IMF because they are in such dire straits usually, but they know that it's not going to be easy. What do financial crises look like? In the post-Bretton Woods era, there's sometimes a currency crisis. This happened in Pakistan in 2018, where the IMF helped to defend the rupee. This is when a speculative attack on the exchange value of a currency results in a sharp depreciation in the value of the currency. And it forces the authorities to expend large volumes of currency reserves and sharply increase the interest rates to defend prevailing interest exchange rates. And so again, this also happened in 1992 in the UK. But more recently, it just happened in 2018, and where the IMF had to get involved. There's also a banking crisis, potentially a loss of confidence in the banking system that could lead to a run on the banks. This happened in Iceland, and where the IMF had to get involved in 2008. As I said, they had a huge crisis, and they've done really well with the IMF involvement, as I said, as I've mentioned. Foreign debt crisis, when a country cannot service its foreign debt obligations. The US might have this because we have so much debt, but not until yet. Thank goodness the IMF has not helped us. We've been helping the IMF, but Greece, Ireland, Portugal all had this issue in 2010. Ireland, right, we think of as a pretty stable country, but they too have had their issues. Here's a photo of the IMF with the director, Christine Lagarde, who's a lawyer from France, at the World Bank headquarters in Washington, D.C. So crisis management by the IMF, evaluating now the IMF's policy prescriptions, because as we say, right, when we go to graduate school, it's really important to question, right? Is the IMF doing something right, or is they doing something wrong? Or is our boss doing something right or doing something wrong? Or is the company that we work for, how are they operating? If we look at the IMF, we see that there are three major pieces where people criticize their policy right now. As we said, 40 countries had working IMF programs. They come with conditions, generally a combination of really tight macroeconomic policy and monetary policy. But why people criticize them is because there are some inappropriate policies, morale hazard. People feel like, oof, I have to, get involved with the IMF. I'm really that low, and a lack of accountability. Let's go through these. Inappropriate policies. So this is what I think is so interesting, because I grew up thinking that the IMF was great, and I had friends who had parents working for the World Bank and the IMF, and they were, geniuses when it came to economic and monetary policy. But today they've been criticized for having a one-size-fits-all approach to macroeconomic policy that's inappropriate for many countries. This showed up in South Korea recently, where there was a collapse in their currency, but actually inflation was still low. And because IMF has this policy about a collapse in a currency, they had to then implement a really unnecessarily tight policy. And that led to a lot of widespread corporate defaults. And people really wonder if that was absolutely necessary, because the inflation was so low. But the IMF just said, you're in a currency crisis. this is what the policy is going to be. And, we really wonder if it was just too much for South Korea at the moment. Morale hazard, as I've mentioned, people, get bummed out by having an IMF loan come in, but also maybe people are behaving recklessly because they know that they'll be saved if things go wrong. This happened in Asia. With the Asian crisis, they said, okay, well, the United States and Europe will come save us if we play with our economic and monetary policy too risky, in a riskier way. Also, there's a lack of accountability. IMF has become too powerful for an institution that lacks any real mechanism for accountability. So who's saying whether what the IMF is doing is right or not? And there's, as I've mentioned in this course before, there's an amazing economist from Columbia University, Jeffrey Sachs, and he's saying that actually they need more experts. They have, 1,000 people working for them, but they really could use some more expertise, in his opinion, and that maybe it's not as efficiently run as it used to be. So what are some observations? But it's not really clear which side is correct about the appropriateness yet of the IMF policies. There's really, the IMF is still running, even though there are criticisms. The IMF cannot force countries to adopt the policies required to correct the economic mismanagement, unfortunately or fortunately. And in recent years, the IMF has started to really change its policies. So they've been kind of listening, it sounds like. And since 2008, since that crisis happened, they've shifted their views really on fiscal stimulus and monetary easing. So yeah, we will see what the future is for the IMF. There's definitely a place and a time for an organization like this, but obviously they just need to keep up with what the current situation is. And now we have things like cryptocurrency that they have to deal with. So we will see what happens in the future. That ends all of our slides. Let's go ahead and review the chapter together. We've described the historical development of the modern global system, thinking about the Standard of Gold and Bretton Woods. We've explained the role played by the World Bank and the IMF in the international monetary system, and how those organizations have really helped a lot of developing countries and have helped countries in crisis. We've compared and contrasted the difference between a fixed and a floating exchange rate. And now we think back, why would you ever be on a fixed system? Well, there's a time and a place for that, or there was a time and a place for that, but now we're on a float or a managed float system. We've identified exchange rate regimes used in the world today and why countries adopt different exchange rate regimes. Right, how you can peg a currency, or connect different currencies, as we saw with the EMS, what they did before the euro. Understood the debate surrounding the role of the IMF and why people are critical of it. And then we've explained the implications of the global monetary system for management practice, which I'll let you do more in class. All right, thank you so much for joining me with chapter 11. I look forward to seeing you in further chapters.